These are the new Tokina Vista-P Cinema Primes, a new version of their fantastic Vista Primes, which introduces this new vintage-inspired look while trying to keep the optical quality which made the irregular Vistas so good. Which is great, because the Vistas are optically some of my favourite lenses out there. They've been used on shows like Ted Lasso, Loki, Vigil, Killing Eve, all of these fantastic high-end dramas. So I'm sure there's an appetite out there for versions of those same lenses, but with a bit more optical character to them. So let's go over what's changed here. Firstly, these are the same lenses physically, the same size and weight and design. In fact, you can get an original set modified to be a Vista-P set by sending them back to Tokina, which is fantastic. And that is actually what I'm holding here. You may have noticed that these lenses don't have that Vista-P logo on them like in the marketing photos, and that's because these are early modified versions of a previous set of Vistas. So they're still the same lenses at their heart. What's changed is some of the coatings, and crucially, some of the optical elements inside. Tokina have changed some of the spacing between lens elements throughout the lens, and this is to introduce some strong spherical distortion, that swirliness at the edge of frame. Tokina specifically referenced the Helios 44 and Fetzel lenses, which are some of the most popular vintage lenses on the market because of that exact swirliness. By going to the effort of tweaking the lens elements throughout the lens to achieve this, Tokina have kept the sharpness and detail of the original lenses the same, which is great to see as that's often not the case. So let's take a look at how they actually look. We filmed our usual lens test angle against the fairy lights in our showroom. Here's the 35mm at t1.5. This is in full frame 8K RAW on the Canon R5C, by the way. This is the 50mm at t1.5, and this is the 85mm at t1.5. And you can really see these swirling towards the edges here with this wall of lights. I think it looks beautiful personally. I also think it's more noticeable on the 35 and the 85 than on the 50 in this shot, which is worth noting considering the comparisons I'm about to show you in a minute are all done on the 50mm. It's also worth making clear that we absolutely did move the lens between these things, obviously, but we didn't match the framing specifically, so these aren't trying to be the exact same shot. If we punch into all three side by side, you can see the amount of detail these lenses are resolving as well, which is fantastic to see on lenses which are designed to have a bit more character. So let's now go through those three focal lengths again, but stop down a little bit each time. So here's the 35mm at t1.5, and here's t2.8. As you'd expect, a lot of the character has now gone. But we're still left with a very beautiful image with great separation and detail. And now here's T4, here's the 50mm again at T1.5, and here's T2.8, and here's T4, and here's the 85mm at T1.5, T2.8, and T4. Now let's look at the flaring, which is actually quite subtle and under control with these lenses. This is the 85mm, and the light has this beautiful blooming around it with a few soft lens orbs, which I think look really nice. And the 50mm is very similar. The 35 is a bit more pronounced, as you'd expect from a wider lens. The light still has this nice soft bloom around it, but the orbs are much stronger. There's a very large orange flare as well, which happens at the opposite edge once the light is out of frame. Now, flaring is a very subjective subject, but personally, I really like the way these lenses flare, particularly the 50 and 85, which give a really subtle and classy feel, in my opinion. Okay, let's now compare these to other lenses. I did a little whiz around the showroom to see what other 50mm lenses I could get my hands on that would make sense to compare these to. And remember that the 50mm Vista-P was the one of these three that we felt had the least obvious stylings and character to it. So there is a bit of a danger that this comparison might underrepresent the Vista-Ps in terms of character because of that. So firstly, this is the 50mm Vista-P on the left and the 50mm original Vista Prime on the right. And here in the center of frame, they look identical. And very nice, it has to be said. The fall off on these lenses is lovely. Move out to the edges of the frame and you start to see the changes. The bokeh of those fairy lights is thinner and more oval shaped, which is what gives that swirly feeling. I'd love to do this comparison with the 85 or the 35, but unfortunately we only have the 50mm of the original Vista Primes to hand right now. But from what I've seen, I would expect these changes at the edges to be much stronger at the 35 and 85mm focal lengths. So the first lens I picked up from a different manufacturer that I wanted to look at was the 50mm Canon Sumire, as the Sumire lenses are very similar in terms of intention of what the manufacturer wanted to achieve. They both wanted a lens with a lot of optical character, and they both used spherical distortion in order to achieve that. Here's the 50mm Sumire, which I have to say I do really love the look of. It has this pretty unique characteristic where the bokeh and the depth of field in the middle is drastically different to that of the edges, which I personally really like, but I have spoken to customers who say it's not really to their taste. So again, it is very subjective. Side by side, it does feel a bit like a stronger and more obvious version of what the Vista-P is trying to achieve. One thing I think the Tokina does better is how well it keeps the outer bokeh even on both sides, while the Canon Sumire does seem to bulge out a bit to one side with a bit of cutting on the other side, if that makes sense. The other vintage style lens I had on hand was the DZO Film Vespid Retro series, and this is the 50mm at its max aperture of t2.1, so noticeably not as shallow as the other lenses, as this is of course a much more affordable lens and a much smaller lens than the Vista-Ps. It also uses coatings to achieve that vintage feel rather than changing the optical design from the original lenses. So it's lower in contrast overall, and the bokeh doesn't really change from the regular Vespid Primes, which all have this quite strong cutting on the bokeh at the edges, while the Vista-P is almost perfectly even on both sides of each fairy light. We then used some more traditional spherical lens designs, which I'll just show quickly. Here's the Sigma Cine 50mm with beautiful round bokeh, very little of that vintage swirliness. I've always loved the look of the Sigma Cine lenses. If you're after that clean look, these are great lenses for you. And then there's my wildcard pick, if you like. This is the Canon RF 50mm f1.2, which I use a lot for this channel. In fact, I'm actually using it right now. I've said many times it's one of my favorite lenses on the market. It is of course a stills lens, and so it doesn't really fit in this test. It's not part of a matching set or anything like that. I really just threw it on here out of curiosity, and I'm glad I did, as the look is much more similar than I thought it would be. The Canon has that same spherical distortion with nice even bokeh in that swirl at the edges. It really is surprisingly similar in this test anyway to the 50mm Vista-P. Although I do think the Tokina has slightly nicer roll-off from Patrick's face to hair. That transition from in focus to out of focus feels much more natural on the Tokina, but both look fantastic. So hopefully those comparisons help you know what to expect from the Vista-P lineup. We've all been very impressed here. I think this approach from Tokina of offering two versions of the Vista Primes, the regular set and then an optically tweaked one with more character, is a very strong one, and I think these could be very popular lenses for them. Perhaps even more popular than the regular Vista Primes. But what do you think of the way these lenses look? Let us know in the comment section, and if you want to buy these or any other lenses, of course, just head over to provi.co.uk. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.